The biblical adage, an eye for an eye, is not a license for vengeance. In the culture that came out of it was a limit on vengeance taking. One eye for one eye, not 3 arms, 2 organs in your head for an eye. As a toddler, I loved cowboys. There are numerous, way too many, I can't track them all down and hide them, photos of me at 2, 3, 4, 5, in the cowboy hat, the little string that went around the chin, and the fake buckskin fringe jacket, and strapped around my waist, toy guns, which I never let my own son have at all, and the broomstick with the horse's head on it. My first guitar was a plastic toy cowboy model, not even designed to play, just a prop. I had the entire collection of Johnny West dolls. Anybody remember that? I think G.I. Joe, but cowboys. And when I was in first grade, as Thanksgiving approached, I was assigned to play an Indian in the first grade reenactment assembly. And I went home and I told my parents that I had to be one of the bad guys. No lie, true story. My dad sat me down and explained to me as best you could to a kid in first grade that the Indians were not necessarily the bad guys. In fact, quite the opposite. The cowboys were the bad guys? My cowboy-loving self at first grade asked. I didn't quite get it. I was in first grade. But as my education continued through the 70s and 80s, my generation was one of the first to learn some of the realities about Thanksgiving beyond the American civic religious myth, if you will. I learned difficult lessons about smallpox blankets and that the Indian wars were basically just a genocide. I learned about the Trail of Tears, forced relocation across half a continent, others forced to inhabit a tiny little fraction of their ancestral lands, and they couldn't leave. Promises and treaties signed, and every single one of them, every single one was broken. Every single one. The breakup of families, children taken from parents, sending Native children to Christian boarding schools where were not allowed to dress in their native clothes, speak their native language, or act and behave in their native ways, or practice their native spirituality. Some of those schools were run by Unitarians. Not even allowed to be citizens of the country that oppressed them until the 20th century. For the great swath of that American history, not really actually people or human, in fact, referred to in our founding documents as the Indian savages. I had learned one story about cowboys and Indians and pilgrims and Indians, and then I found out that the story was wrong. At best, incredibly and intensely incomplete. As our spiritual guru for today's holiday would say, I had to unlearn what I had learned. I had to imagine another story. And then I had to learn about that story. I had to imagine a story that flipped the good guys and the bad guys, that rearranged who I thought was who and what I thought was what. The white government of the United States of America, with intention and forethought, set out to maintain domination over the native peoples of this land. They set up a system that systemically oppressed the native peoples of this land and consistently and horrendously committed human rights violations in enforcing those rules in order to maintain and control that population. And this has not yet completely ended. It started for me with a biography of Abraham Lincoln. And by the end of grade school, I became obsessed with the American Civil War. At one point, I achieved an incredible milestone. I had read every single book in the children's section of the Leominster, Massachusetts Public Library related to the Civil War. They ordered a new one for me, a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. I thought it was a wonderful, virtuous story about how the virtuous, holy people of the northern states, like Massachusetts, where I lived, went to war against the horrible, evil people of the southern states who kept black people as slaves, and then finally liberated the slaves, achieving freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for black people in America. And this independent study was more or less reinforced in my junior high American history class. And the year I took that class, I watched Roots on TV. Broadcast network TV, remember that? You had to make an appointment, show up at the same time every night for the next episode. Until I watched Roots, I had learned about slavery as a child and a student, but it was an abstraction. I wouldn't have known that word then, but it was an abstraction. It involved, in reality, gruesomeness I really couldn't even process while I was still in junior high school. People were kidnapped from their homeland, forcibly relocated somewhere else, deported from their own country to a foul, inhuman existence, families ripped apart, people bought and sold like livestock, children taken from parents, beatings, torture, sexual assault, every possible degradation. And then the history class got to the part after the Civil War, where for a few years of Reconstruction, things started to turn around a little bit. Black people were elected to Congress. And then white people in the former southern states of the Civil War got really scared. Reconstruction turned on a dime. And these few steps of progress were cruelly and intentionally reversed. And although slavery was abolished, the South returned to remain a legally racist and discriminatory state. I had to unlearn what I had learned. I had to imagine another story. I had to learn more about that story. And had to learn with the realization that as far back as the Constitution itself, the enslaved peoples in the United States were not human. At best, they were 3/5 human. Learned the lesson that the North benefited from slavery. The textile mills wouldn't make money without slave labor. Learned that Abraham Lincoln, the week before the Gettysburg Address, ordered the execution of over 36 Native American warriors who had the audacity to take up arms and fight back against the people that were exterminating them and taking their land. Executed under United States law as, get this, terrorists. And this domination has been constantly reinforced over and over and over again. I had to learn about Tulsa and Jim Crow laws and lynching and cross burnings and racial profiling and redlining and the school to prison pipeline. And still amazed in my role as a minister that I had to explain to some peoples in my congregation that all lives matter is not legitimate. Because what Black Lives Matter means is all lives should matter, but Black lives still don't. I'm going to Portugal next month. I've been in the ministry 18 years, and I'm going to take a sabbatical. Never had one. I am intensely grateful to you all. You have no idea. All my mom's grandparents came from Portugal and the Azores. Some of you know I know how to cook all the food. I'm now learning the language. Estou a aprender de português agora. É percebe? I am beyond excited. I love my Portuguese heritage. I grew up with grandparents and great aunts who still spoke the language, a great uncle who made vinho verde in his garage with the grapes he grew in his garden. I knew what a galo de Barcelos was as a child. I had a vovô and a avô, not a grandparents. My brother and I will still root for Portugal in the World Cup because at least we have a chance of winning. I learned in school that the Portuguese were some of the world's greatest explorers. First was to sail around the southern tip of Africa, found South America, Prince Henry the Navigator funding all kinds of exploration, and Portugal ruled the seas. And I just thought all that was great. I was Portuguese. And then I learned later on in my life that Prince Henry the Navigator and Vasco da Gama weren't explorers. They were colonizers and exploiters who basically stole riches from other people's lands. Perhaps worst of all, they were enslavers. Not just enslavers. In a sense, they have the inglorious distinction, my ancestors do, of starting the transatlantic slave trade in earnest. And adding to it the reason that let it blossom and continue. We weren't kidnapping and making people prisoners and slaves. We were saving their souls and bringing them the gospel of Jesus Christ. Their philosophy gave rise to what became known as the doctrine of discovery. That in the name of Christ, we can go conquer other people's land and take it as ours because we're saving their souls. I had to unlearn what I had learned about my heritage. I had to learn a new story. One of the monuments I will visit while I'm in Portugal is in the Belém neighborhood of Lisbon. That's Lisboa, I'm learning. It's a monument of the explorers, funded in part by the apartheid government of South Africa, with whom Portugal was buddy-buddy during their time as a fascist dictatorship. Oh, I gotta unlearn what I have learned. Once again. In college, I learned more about South Africa. A college administrator contacted me my junior year and said we were getting a student from South Africa. And I was invited to meet her at a gathering with the other international students. And I was going to write a story about her for the student paper. And there were reporters and a photographer there from the local town paper to meet her too. And we were told we could not photograph her face or use her real name. Naive 20-year-old me asked why. Because they may hurt my children, she said. Whew. That's how I met Tobago. I can use her name now. The apartheid government's fallen. Tobago is from Pinville, Soweto, and if you recognize the name, it's the site of the Soweto student uprising in the southwest slums of Johannesburg in 1976, where hundreds and hundreds of students rallied for the right to be able to go to school in their own native language. And they were shot at and killed by the South African security forces. The students were violent criminals. They were terrorists. 3.5 million people forcibly relocated from where they lived to Bantustans, black homelands, basically reservations, that they could not leave, they could not vote, they could not hold certain jobs, they could not travel without a permit. They couldn't even speak their own language in school. Discrimination by skin color was taken to a high art form, probably never equaled by the South African government. There were 4 major classifications: white, black, colored, and Indian. And each of those had dozens of subclassifications, and you had more rights by law the whiter you were. Look it up sometimes, it's stunning. A minority white population created and maintained domination over the black majority through systemic oppression brutally enforced by human rights violations. People were disappeared. They were labeled terrorists for talking about black power. South Africa didn't just ban books, they banned people. Banned people had to remain in house arrest. They could only be in a room with one person at a time. And that included members of their immediate family. They were forbidden to speak in public or publish anything. They couldn't use the telephone. Oh boy, this is so enlivening this morning. All these stories we have to unlearn as we learn more about what's really going on. Like most people my age, and I'm sure most of you, I grew up in the wake of World War II, and I learned about the Holocaust. How the evil, and they were, Nazis practiced racist, religious, and ethnic apartheid, ultimately practicing genocide, and this was finally stopped by that paragon of democracy and treating everyone with equal human rights, the United States of America. Of course, there were no integrated troops that liberated those camps. And we could go on and on. Once more, I had to unlearn what I had learned, or at best, relearn a more complete story of what I had learned. I had to learn that the Nazis actually copied their final solution from the United States. They were amazed at how the United States could be a paragon of virtue and democracy around the world and yet have the Jim Crow laws and the American Indian reservations. The Nazis wanted to do the same thing. They studied us. They knew how to do it well. And they learned from the master and even surpassed it. I knew that anti-Semitism existed as a child. I first kind of learned about it third hand through making friends with Derek Goldberg, who was the only Jewish boy in my grade growing up through grade school. I didn't learn till later that anti-Semitism had an incredibly long and distant history that went all the way back to the founding of my religion, Christianity. In the Easter story, trying to blame the Jewish people for the death of Jesus when it was actually the Romans that crucified him. And over the years, that helped lead to immeasurable acts of hatred and discrimination and violence through 2,000 plus years of pogroms and expulsions and exterminations. And I learned that the state of Israel was created in the wake of World War II to give the Jewish people a home where they could be safe from that kind of history. And so that oppression would finally stop, hopefully. And I got that stuck in my head that Israel was the good guys, like the cowboys and the Portuguese and the northern states. I worked for Amnesty International when I got out of college, and I was there during the middle of the first Intifada. And in 1990, in the middle of the first Intifada, I learned that it was really difficult to criticize Israel in any way without being labeled anti-Semitic. And I learned that because the office I worked in received bomb threats for daring to publish the human rights abuses of the Israeli Defense Forces during the Intifada. I had to start to unlearn a story I had learned. One can have legitimate criticisms of anybody without it being directly connected to their personal identities. Now, sometimes it is directly connected to entities, and people make personal attacks because people are Black or female or Jewish or trans. We know that. But just because someone has a certain identity does not mean that they are always virtuous. We know that too. One can be a Jewish person who behaves unethically, just like one can be any other kind of person who behaves unethically. One can be a nation that behaves unethically, just like any nation can behave unethically. You can be a patriot and criticize America. Now, some people will say you can't if you oppose the Vietnam War or the CIA-backed coups in Latin America that installed dictatorships. Or you remind people that the taking of American hostages in Iran in 1979 and the bombing of the two towers, the World Trade Center towers, happened in retaliation for the incredibly bad behavior and policies of the United States. You get labeled anti-American real fast. But you got to unlearn sometimes what you have learned because it's the actual story. It doesn't justify the taking of hostages, the bombing of the towers. That's still evil. But it doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from a history of American policies that made people so frustrated and so angry they resorted to that kind of way of acting out. And I know this isn't the best analogy, but it's how I think of it a lot because I was a big athlete and played a lot of sports growing up. It's like the syndrome in sports where the referee never sees the original foul. They always call a penalty on the player who retaliates. So no matter what sport you're watching, you'll see some player commit a foul and the referee will call and give him a penalty. And then the announcers will show a video clip of what happened 30 seconds before when the player who that foul was committed against was the one who committed the foul on the player committing the other foul. But the referee gets the retaliation person the penalty, and the person who really committed the first penalty and set off that fit of temper and the second player who got the, you get it, right? It's not exactly the same thing in international relations, but it's not that far off either. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid defines apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group and systematically oppressing them. Just like the United States history with Native peoples and Black peoples and South Africa's treatment of Native peoples and Nazi treatment of Jewish people and Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. And before I go on, this is a difficult topic for me. I once tried to explain the Palestinian side of events that were happening in 2011 to people in my congregation. And two people of Jewish background accused me of anti-Semitism and worked to run me out of the congregation, which they did successfully. And all I was doing was trying to get people to understand where this behavior came from, not justifying it, not denigrating Israel or Jewish people. So I entered these waters with a little trepidation as a minister, but I have to. Israel has always had a law enforcing a Jewish majority. Great way to run a democracy, enforce that your party always has a majority of votes. Sounds like who gets to vote in the American South under Jim Crow, doesn't it? Israeli law guarantees citizenship to Jews, but citizenship in Israel is conditional for Palestinians and can be revoked at any time. Israel controls Palestinians' education, medical care, where they can shop, how they can do international business. Its arbitrary and discriminatory permitting processes limit Palestinians' personal freedom, freedom of where they live, their economic development, and the natural growth of their own villages and communities. There was an evil, and no, I'm saying evil, this is beyond the pale. This was an evil terrorist attack of October 7th when Hamas murdered 1,200 Israelis and took 250 hostages. In response to date, Israel has killed over 50,000 Palestinians and injured over 100,000 others. A humanitarian crisis of epic, I would say even biblical proportions, for lack of food and water and medical care on a scale vastly imaginable, continues unabated. The biblical adage, an eye for an eye, is not a license for vengeance. In the culture that came out of it was a limit on vengeance taking. One eye for one eye, not 3 arms, 2 organs in your head for an eye. History is written by the winners. And the stories of history, as we know, are neither always accurate nor complete. And yet it remains incredibly difficult to unlearn the warped versions of stories we inherit about who we are, who we have been, so much so to the degree that we don't really have an accurate sense sometimes of who we now are. We must unlearn what we have learned and relearn. This is a constant process of human life and personal growth and education. We must unlearn and relearn constantly, especially those of us with power and privilege who most likely have created the stories we tell. Privilege and power frames good and evil and dehumanizes the villain. Native Americans, Black Africans, European Jews, and Palestinians, all labeled as less than human and treated as such. Dehumanization is an absolute requirement for domination and control because it's incredibly difficult to hate someone face to face or harm someone you consider to be equally human just like you. And stories of dehumanization and domination must be consistent and systemic to be pervasive and controlling. And as we hear the rising chorus of anti-trans and anti-immigrant hate in our country, we know where this is leading if we allow it to remain unchecked. We must unlearn what we have learned. But we can. I know that was heavy this morning. I know. But we must unlearn sometimes what we have learned in order to learn a new story, in order to write a new story, in order to teach that story to others. We imagine a new story, we create the new story, we teach the new story, we make the new story the reality. So, our call, our challenge is to write the new story. Let us write a story of a free and thriving human family, where past mistakes are corrected and democracy is realized and human rights for everyone are truly respected, where all people are honored and included and loved and valued, and where love is not just an emotion or a word we put on a poster at the center of our values, but a true force of actual liberation. Check out my website and blog at tonylorenzen.com for even more resources that will open your mind, touch your heart, and inspire your spirit.